Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released by the Beatles in May of 1967, and ever since then it's been held as one of the most important and influential releases of all time. Not only because of the clear quality of the songwriting, having some of the most recognizable and popular songs by the band, such as A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and With a Little Help of My Friends, but also because of how much of a big inspiration it was for the growing psychedelic scene in the late 60s, inspiring people like the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, the Kings, and the Yardbirds. However, as years go by and more albums are released week after week, it's pretty clear that the legacy of Sgt. Pepper's isn't really what it used to be. I mean, 20 years ago, this album was held as the pinnacle of the Beatles, as the greatest achievement in the history of music, and nowadays, albums like Revolver, Abbey Road, and the White Album get way more recognition from the critics. This is especially true when you try and introduce the album to younger generations. I'm pretty sure you'll find thousands of videos on YouTube of people talking about how overrated Sgt. Pepper's is, and actually one of my favorite creators on this platform, Anthony Fantano, the Needle Drop, has made a video talking about the legacy of the album and how even though it's a classic record, it doesn't really deserve a 10 out of 10 score. It's not a perfect album, and he quotes quite a few tracks that he doesn't like from the record, like Good Morning, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, Lovely Rita, She's Leaving Home.
But songs and song ideas, this was far from the Beatles' best, and I feel like that's kind of a necessary part, especially an album that I would consider to be perfect track for track, an album that is flawless front to back, 10 out of 10.
Also, the fact that now we have easy access to pretty much every album that has ever been released made a lot of people realize that Sgt. Pepper's was far from being the first psychedelic album ever released, and even in terms of influence, albums like Pet Sounds, albums like Revolver were way more impactful for the music scene. Both of these arguments do have a point. I mean, the album has a very confusing track list with some of the greatest songs ever made on one side of the album, and then you have some of the most annoying songs by the band on the other side, such as Good Morning, such as Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Then you also find songs that completely break the pace of the album, such as Within You Without You, a really interesting song, but even if you like the song, it's pretty obvious that it doesn't really belong in an album such as Sgt. Pepper's, which was really colorful and energetic and fun and playful. Instead, this song seems to be meditational, philosophic, not really the type of song you want to hear in the middle of an album like Sgt. Pepper's. Then you have When I'm 64, a track that I love. You should go ahead and check out my ranking of the Sgt. Pepper songs. I have a video on the channel where I do a worst to best of the album, and honestly, I love the track. I think it's really cute. I love singing along to the song, and I love the little love story that Paul McCartney tells in this one about growing old with the person you love, but I believe that it's pretty obvious too that this song completely breaks the pace of the album. Not really colorful, not really fast-paced, not really a lot of modifications and, adornments in the instrumental, so it feels out of place. Considering the fact that this album is often called the greatest achievement in recording history, it's pretty obvious that people are going to note this little flaws the album has and say, listen, how can it be the greatest if it has a couple of songs that are literally annoying? But even if a lot of these claims make sense, taking the songs individually and rating them is just the wrong way to approach the album. This was one of the first examples of the concept album there is. Therefore, you're supposed to look at it as a 39-minute song, not as a collection of tracks. That's the reason why maybe songs like Good Morning, and Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite are really annoying when I pull them out of the record, but once I listen to the songs inside the album, I don't really mind them. Actually, it makes a lot of sense. They're colorful, they're playful, they try to adorn the track with a lot of different elements that are not necessarily instruments. They play around with the different shades of the coloring the album offers, and the sound palette, even though it has different instruments and different tempos and, different songwriting styles, it makes sense. It's a similar sound palette, and that makes the album feel cohesive from start to finish. The pace is a problem. The pacing of the album is not necessarily the best, and this is something I cannot excuse. It's simply a flaw the album has, but when it comes to the track list, I really find no problems outside of the fact that maybe if you were to compare the songs track for track with some of the other albums by the Beatles, like Abbey Road, the White Album, and Revolver, definitely those albums are going to be way better. Actually, I would even go as far as to say that Magical Mystery Tour track for track has better songs overall. That's one of the main reasons why it's so hard to introduce this album to younger generations, including myself. I'm 23 years old. The way I listen to music is when I listen to an album, I play the songs individually, and if I don't like it, I jump to the next one. I don't really listen to the whole thing. I don't give it the benefit of the doubt. I don't wait for the song to do anything. And listening to Sgt. Pepper's for the first time, it was really complicated for me to get into the album. It got to a point where even albums like A Hard Day's Night and Help were better in my eyes, just because they had, better and more impressive songs when you played them individually. But back back in the day, it wasn't really like that. You bought an album, you put it on your record player, and you let the album play. So obviously, people that enjoy the album that way, back in 1967 when it was released, had an epiphany listening to the record, not only because of the colors, not only because of how shiny and fun and playful the album is, but also because of how cohesive and how consistent in terms of its sound palette the album is. In other words, if you find yourself not enjoying Sgt. Pepper's, if you don't really understand what the hype is all about, go ahead and give the album another try. This time, no texting, no phones, no distractions. Don't use it as background music. Pay attention to every single chord, every single instrument, every single vocal melody and voice mods used in the album, and then I'm pretty sure you'll understand the greatness of Sgt. Pepper's. Maybe you won't like it, maybe still you'll find other albums by the Beatles to be more enjoyable and better overall, but the point is for you to understand, venture your mind to someone in 1967 playing this album for the first time and being completely blown away by it. I'm pretty sure that you'll have a similar experience if your imagination is, powerful enough, because I remember listening to the Beatles discography for the first time, fell in love with the White Album, fell in love with Abbey Road, with Revolver, with Rubber Soul, with Let It Be, with A Hard Day's Night, and when it came to Sgt. Pepper's, even though I enjoyed the majority of the songs in that album, I couldn't really understand why this was seen as the greatest achievement by the Beatles until I decided to sit down and take in everything the album had to offer, and that's when I realized how different and special this album really is.
People say to me, what's my favourite album that I've made? And what I always say, I haven't made my Sgt. Pepper yet.
But the quality of the track list isn't the only problem people have with this album, because in the eyes of many, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys is a much better album and deserves a lot more credit. And the reason for this is pretty much obvious. Pet Sounds is probably the most influential and important album ever released in the pop music scene. Every single pop song ever released draws influence from Pet Sounds, its instrumentation, the way it was recorded, the melodies, the vocal melodies that album features, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this. Pet Sounds is the blueprint for pop music. So why is it that Sgt. Pepper's is seen as the pinnacle of music, the greatest achievement of recording history? Well, the thing is that in terms of sound, once you leave the psychedelic music scene, Sgt. Pepper's wasn't really that influential. I mean, it was, but not as much as albums like Abbey Road and Rubber Soul, and definitely not as much as Pet Sounds, but it was influential in a different way. First of all, the album is responsible for changing the way the music was perceived by the media. So it wasn't only a form of entertainment now, it was also a form of art. And that led to a lot of artists after the Beatles to take a more artistic approach to both songwriting and instrumentation, and that resulted in some of the greatest albums of all time. There's also the fact that this was a really bold move by the Beatles, changing their sound completely. There's a lot of people that argue that the psychedelia was there since Rubber Soul, but those songs were rock music infused with psychedelic sounds. Sgt. Pepper's was psychedelic music infused with other genres that go from music hall to pop music to rock music to even folk. And yes, Pet Sounds was also a bit of a bold move by the Beach Boys, but it wasn't nearly as crazy as Sgt. Pepper's. Plus, Pet Sounds didn't do so well in terms of sales. Instead, the Beatles sold, I think, 250,000 copies in the first week of the release of Sgt. Pepper's, and right now it's one of the best-selling albums of all time, selling more than 32 million copies worldwide. There's also the fact that Sgt. Pepper's was a beacon that showed people that change and creativity in music could be extremely enjoyable, to the point where I personally feel like albums like Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall, and maybe albums like Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, Black Sabbath's debut album, wouldn't be as popular as they are today, if not for Sgt. Pepper's. And I know that that's a bit of a bold statement. I know that a lot of people are going to call me crazy for saying that, but when I explore the history of music, I noticed that a lot of the albums that were considered groundbreaking, creative, and innovative prior to Sgt. Pepper's didn't really do so well in terms of sales. But after Sgt. Pepper's, it seems like creativity and being bold and doing something no one else was doing at the time was rewarded with a lot of sales, with a lot of popularity and a lot of attention. At least for me, that's the biggest achievement of Sgt. Pepper's. People were ready to embrace change. People were eager to listen to the next Sgt. Pepper's, to the next creative powerhouse, and that led to some of the most amazing albums in the history of music.
When they made Sgt. Pepper in '67, we were in the same studio making our first record, and I remember when it came out, pulling the Zephyr 4 over into a lay-by and listening to the whole thing and just sitting there with my mouth hanging open going, wow, this is so complete and accomplished and whatever. But it also was more than that. It had a ton of ideas and a ton of narrative in it. And I feel more than any other record, it was the record that gave me and my generation permission to branch out and do whatever we want to. But if they can do it, we can do it.
So the next time you're listening to Sgt. Pepper's, consider the fact that you're not only listening to some of the best songs that the psychedelic music scene has to offer in the form of A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, With a Little Help of My Friends, Lovely Rita, but you're also listening to a piece of music history that changed the way the music was perceived and inspired many generations of musicians to do something different with their sound, to be creative and innovative, and this resulted in some of the greatest discographies of all time: Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, the Talking Heads, Radiohead. Listing all of the artists that were inspired by Sgt. Pepper's is almost impossible because the influence of this album was so massive. So even though there's many other albums that maybe in terms of quality are way better than Sgt. Pepper's, including some albums inside the band's own discography, but that does not mean that the legacy and legend of Sgt. Pepper's is exaggerated. This is in fact one of the most important and influential albums ever released. To the point where you better believe me when I tell you that without Sgt. Pepper's, music would look a lot different today.
Hey, look at John, will ya?
What's the matter, John, love? Blue meanies?
Newer and bluer meanies have been sighted within the vicinity of this theatre. There's only one way to go out.
How's that?
Singing!
And that's going to be pretty much it for today's video. This video is not going to be that long, and I'm really happy about that. I'm also really excited to see what you guys will have to say in the comments. If you disagree or if you agree with me, go ahead and drop it down below. If you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to react to a song, album, or artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.